Thank you guys all for being on the call. I first came to know Darren Murph virtually when we were both in consumer electronics, ironically. I was leading global brand for a small Apple accessory maker, and he was an editor at Engadget. Both of us, huge Apple enthusiasts. I assume you haven't turned, right, Darren?
No, that's correct. Still loyal.
Still loyal. And as it turned out, both of us enjoyed working from wherever we wanted to be. Some of you know that I've kind of moved around, and Darren's the same. He ended up on the East Coast of North Carolina. I ended up in DC, but Darren's always been a super prolific writer. And when he was at Engadget, he wrote some 20,000 articles, which still blows my mind, earning himself a Guinness World Record in publishing. Today, he is GitLab's head of remote, and he works right there at the intersection of culture and process and hiring and employer branding and marketing and communications. And he's spent his career leading remote teams. It's a natural fit for him. It's something he's been passionate about for a long time. And then he's also kind of has helped other teams along the way with remote transformation, which I think is where today he can be particularly insightful for those of you who, may have been halfway working from home, but now this is a complete new world for you. So Darren co-authored GitLab's remote playbook, and he also has written a book called Living the Remote Dream, a guide to seeing the world, setting records, and advancing your career. Now he lives the dream in North Carolina with his wife and his 15-month-old son, Maverick. So he totally understands that dude that's on the video that the kid comes in and the wife comes in like a ninja. So we can talk about some of those fun times. Right, Darren?
Absolutely. 100%.
Let's go.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Shannon. Thank you all for being gracious with your time. I realize it's valuable, and I hope that this is going to be useful. So a little bit more context on me. I've worked remotely across the spectrum of remote for my entire career, so over 14 years. I have worked in co-located spaces. I've worked in hybrid remote situations where a subset of the company is in an office and a subset is remote. And now at GitLab, we are the world's largest all remote company. So we have over 1,200 people across more than 67 countries with no offices anywhere. So even our executive team, they either work from their home or a co-working space. There's no office to go to. If you dial up Google Maps and try to find GitLab in San Francisco, you will very sadly be taken to a UPS store where we get our taxes, but there's nothing fancy about that. So we've learned a lot. I've learned a lot. Remote is much easier now than it was 14 years ago. I don't know if Shannon remembers this, but 3G wasn't a thing, and laptop batteries lasted about 15 minutes. So you had to really really want it to work remotely over a decade ago. Now we have things like LTE and Zoom, which works without a hitch, and it's a bit more a part of the culture. Nevertheless, this COVID-19 phenomenon has shocked the system, and I think it's a major reset button in a lot of ways. It's a reset culturally, it's a reset societally. You were joking about the video with the kid walking in, but I think this one moment in time has now taken that. We're no longer going to look at that as the thing that it used to be. Like, we're not trying to replicate a sterile boardroom anymore. We all understand that we're in this together. We're all in each other's homes. So we're going to give each other more grace on what our backgrounds are. At GitLab, we like to say that meetings are about the work, not the background. So don't worry about what the background is. If your kid comes in, that's the best distraction in the world. That means you're close to family. And since when is that a bad thing? So I want this to be very conversational. I get that GitLab is in a unique spot. We have the infrastructure for remote. We were built to be remote from day one. Our IT processes were built for remote. Our systems access was built for remote. Every part of our business was built for remote. And for companies that have been thrust into remote, or maybe they were partially remote, now they're fully remote, there's a lot that goes into that. And there's a lot of unlearning and relearning while you're still trying to run your business. And so I'll start by saying what's happening now in remote is not really indicative of what remote will be if you lay the proper infrastructure and the world is relatively normal. Even at GitLab, where work from home is very common for us, it still feels a little weird right now. This still isn't your typical remote environment. Things are still a little strange. We have about a fifth of our company actually that doesn't work from home. They actually work from co-working spaces or external offices, and GitLab will reimburse for those because we know that not everyone's home is amenable to remote. So we have about a fifth of the company that are now having to work at home, and they don't really have a good setup for that. So they're more in line with what the rest of the world is. Layer on top of that, a lot of kids are home from school, and we're trying to homeschool and like keep our kids from injuring themselves while working. It's a lot. So I'd be happy to open it up for questions if we have any, Tyler. And if not, I'll kind of go through some of the here and now implementations that I would recommend for leaders that are in this situation, and then that might trigger some questions. So just let me know. No questions yet. All right, cool. Well, let me start with this. A lot of the companies that I've been talking with have asked me, what do we need to do in the here and now to stabilize and to remove the chaos of remote? And I answer that with two things. The first is to establish a remote leadership team, to put someone in charge, to put a team in charge, and to add some accountability. And what that really means is opening up a feedback mechanism for your employees that are suddenly remote. A lot of the chaos comes from communication breakdowns, and so communications is the second layer to that. That's the thing you need to get solved quickly. What I've seen is that if you empower employees that are suddenly distributed to give you feedback on what's working, what's not working, what communication is breaking down, what channels aren't functioning anymore, what systems aren't working anymore the way they used to. If there's a single source of truth for that feedback, and you have a leadership team that's looking at that, looking for common threads, you start to understand what the priority list is for what do we need to solve and in what order. Usually this is steeped in communication, and I would say minimize your tool stack, minimize the channels of communication at a time like this. You don't need additional chaos added in terms of additional tools or additional processes if you can avoid it at all. And so just to give you a glimpse on how GitLab does this, we have a pretty minimal tool stack. We use G Suite, so Google Docs, Google Slides. We use Zoom for all of our video communications. We use Slack for informal communications, and I'll touch on that in a bit. And then we use GitLab, the product, to do all of our actual work and how we communicate asynchronously. So a couple of things that I think you can start doing right now that will start getting you into the right mindset of remote, because as much as anything else, remote is a mindset, is a culture. And I actually just stood up a handbook page in the GitLab handbook on the phases of remote adaptation. A lot of leaders are kind of putting this undue pressure on themselves to go from no experience in remote to mastery in remote overnight. And I would not recommend doing that. The goal would be to graduate from phase 1 to 2 to 3 and onward in a sustainable and efficient manner. So I'm going to run through what does that look like in terms of meetings, and I think this is something that you can apply right now. So in a co-located space, the default to getting any work done or consensus generated would be to have a meeting. So you would reserve a boardroom, you would try to get as many people as you could synchronously to get together in the same physical space for half an hour or an hour and get as much as you can get done in that 1 hour. Whoever's in the room can contribute. Whoever was away that day or could not make the meeting, sorry, that's your input isn't happening in this meeting because you couldn't be there. So the first step, if you were thrust into remote, is I liken this to skeuomorphism. Like, let's try to copy what happens in the office and paste it in the virtual world. This is the natural human default, which is possible. So you just invite those same people, same time slot, but instead of the boardroom name, now you have a Zoom link. And so you have the meeting in Zoom, kind of just like you would have had it in an office. When it's done, congratulations. Like, you made it happen. Like, the business didn't fall apart, you still had the meeting. But that's not the ideal way to do it. The virtual world actually opens up a lot more possibilities to work in a more efficient way. And so if you're just copying and pasting, it's inefficient at best, and it's actually really frustrating at worst, because a lot of the practices that work in the office, they start to fall apart when you're in a virtual world. So what's phase 2 of that? Well, phase 2 of that would be making the meeting somewhat more asynchronous. And so the way GitLab does this is whenever we have a meeting, we attach a Google Doc agenda to this meeting. So if the meeting is scheduled 5 days out, at 5 days out, there's an agenda doc attached to it. And so if 3 days before you have an idea like, oh, I need to remember to mention this in that meeting, well, you're never going to remember that. So you just go to the meeting invite, you click on the Google Doc agenda, you open it up, you write it down, you close it, done. 3 days from now, when you get in the meeting, you open up the Google Doc, wonderful, there it is. So the next phase of this would be, all right, everyone still has the same Zoom meeting, we still try to get the right people in the room, but we have that Google Doc there now. And so once that's there, you open it up, and any questions that happen in the meeting, you actually write those down in real time. Whoever asks types it out. And then whatever the answers are, whatever the takeaways are, you write those down as well. And so when the meeting is done, now there's some sort of track record, and there are services that will transcribe these as well. They don't work super well. They don't have a lot of good context, but they're getting there. And so now you've kind of graduated, like, okay, we've added documentation into the flow, like we're getting somewhere. So the next phase of this would be, let's schedule a meeting if it's necessary. Let's invite whoever can make it, but we're going to make the meeting fully asynchronous, as in you don't have to be in the meeting to actually contribute to the meeting. So if you have a question for this meeting, you can go into the agenda doc a few days in advance, put your name, what the question is, and then someone in the meeting, once it actually happens, will verbalize it for you, write down what the answer was, add the context, and then you can actually ingest that asynchronously. You'll also record the meeting, so that if someone sees, they read through the agenda and they say, oh, that's an interesting part, I want to see what the discussion was around that, you can go find the video file and watch it, so they don't even have to be there. As you grow a remote team and time zones become more of an issue, this is extremely, extremely helpful. The fourth phase of this would be the meeting organizer would ask themselves before they ever schedule a meeting, is this meeting even necessary? Is the topic that we're talking about possible to be addressed asynchronously? So I'm going to give you a peek into how GitLab views iteration. It's one of our core values. You may say you need a meeting to discuss the fiscal year 21 marketing plan, and you're probably right. That's probably meeting worthy. But the real question you should be asking is, what are the components that make up the marketing plan? What are the questions, the 20 or 30 questions that will need to be asked in sequence so that we have a fully baked marketing plan? Because chances are, if you break it down to its smallest possible components, you could ask each of those individual questions in an asynchronous way. We use GitLab, so we would stand up a GitLab issue, we would write down the question, we would tag the people that we thought might have the answer. They could think about it in their own time, in their own space. They could write down their answers and their thoughts with context and precision. They could tag other people, bring in other thoughts, and then all of this would be permanently documented. So even in 2025, you can look back at this issue and think, wow, this is how we came to develop this marketing plan. These were the things that were happening in our world. That stops the knowledge leak that happens in meetings currently, which is in one ear, out the other, for the most part. And this is the final phase where documentation isn't just something you do to supplement a meeting. It's something you do because it's more efficient than a meeting. When you start replacing office environment norms with new norms and traditions that work in a remote first environment, that's kind of the final frontier, where you've graduated from just stabilizing the company and making sure we don't fall apart in a virtual environment to now we've built this into the fabric of the company. Now this is who we are. This is the infrastructure that we run on. So even if we do go back to the office, we're still going to work asynchronously. We're still going to work with documentation at the core, because it's just a better way to do business. It has nothing to do with geography, and it's at this point, it's purely about what's a more efficient way to work. So hopefully that's kind of a useful anecdote just on meetings, something that could be started today. There's nothing stopping you from attaching a Google Doc agenda to every meeting that you've already got scheduled. Just add them, don't stress out about what meetings do we need to cancel. You'll get there, you'll get there. For now, just attach that meeting agenda to meetings, start documenting in the meetings, and then start sharing that out with the company. So opening it up to a broader swath of the company. It's more transparent. There's less communication silos. More people know what's going on. They have context about what's going on in the business. Context and communication are two of the biggest things to fail in a remote environment. So you have to be really intentional about making sure that people have access to that knowledge. So I've talked a lot about that. Tyler, have any questions come in?
Yeah, I've got a couple
Cool.
for you. Yeah. So first of all, we recognize that for most of the companies on the call, they're possibly part-time remote, but now they're full-time remote. And I guess from GitLab's perspective, what stands out as unique to the GitLab workforce now, given COVID-19, versus the sort of the normative work from home that GitLab already had going on?
Not a lot has changed except for the people that used to work in co-working spaces and now they have to work from home, and the people that used to have kids in school and now they don't. So we've had to shift our expectations, and we have, thankfully, we're a very transparent company. We actually have a parenting channel in our Slack, company Slack, where people can just talk about tips that they've been using, programs that they've been using to help with that. So we've had to kind of manage and adjust the metrics and expectations for folks that have kids, but the day-to-day has largely been unchanged because we've kind of been built for this. It actually reminds me of one thing that I wanted to talk about in that earlier bit about Slack. So this is also something you can start today. I think it would be a little more jarring, but something to consider, and it helps unpack the mindset of remote. So I said that all of our work happens in GitLab. We use GitLab issues and GitLab merge requests to do everything, even non-dev projects. And so it's like the natural question is, well, what do you use Slack for? We actually expire our Slack messages after 90 days. So anyone can turn this feature on. You just kill the Slack messages after 90 days. So like, well, why would you do that? It serves two purposes in a remote environment. One is it's a forcing function to not do work in Slack. Because if you know you can't query something, you're never going to start a project in Slack because you know you can't go Control F and find what you were talking about. We want this forcing function in place because instead of just instinctively starting something in Slack, which is a terrible place to work, information is siloed, 40,000 red bubbles, it's a mental health nightmare, absolutely the worst place you could ever work. So instead, we want the work to start where it needs to end up, which in our case is in a GitLab issue. So that's the one thing it does. The second thing it does is it makes Slack an amazing informal communication tool. So one of the things I often hear is, I love the energy of the office. Now we've all been thrust into the home. I miss my comrades. I miss that camaraderie. I miss the vibe and the energy. I can't find a good replacement for that. So what we do is we have a ton of public topical channels, anything from mental health to hiking to music, cooking. And as I mentioned, there's a parenting one. Well, the parenting one has been essential. We've had some amazing concepts to come from that. People are across the world are like, hey, I have kids home now. Anyone have any great recommendations on education programs or apps for kids aged whatever to whatever? And then someone 3 continents away is like, oh yeah, try this. The other thing we've done on an informal communication front is whenever we have a meeting on Zoom, anyone that doesn't have a back-to-back and they have kids can just opt to leave their camera on. And then they'll just go like, hey kids, and the kids will come in and then they get 10 or 15 minutes to just meet other kids from around the world, like speak different languages to each other, like share what music they're playing with, like show off toys, whatever. And we've actually expanded that. We now have a company schedule where parents can like grab blocks of time with other parents and have like this kid get together to give their kids a chance to kind of explore other cultures and meet with other kids. And I think that's really, it's a cool peek into not being upset about what you don't have anymore and looking at what can we do now that would have been impossible before. Like the things that you're able to do, the connections you're able to build, the portals you're able to open with a Zoom chat versus this one office is really immense. The trick is you have to be intentional about it. Just last week, our entire marketing department had a talent show. So we had 135 people on a Zoom, and the meeting was scheduled 2 weeks in advance. So there was an agenda there 2 weeks in advance, and anybody that wanted to show all the talent could sign up, and we went in order. And at the end of it, it was like a judging panel, and people got prizes. Like it was a thing. Somebody actually had cooking as one of the talents, and so they're actually like having their phone in the kitchen, and it's just like Gordon Ramsay happening. Like that couldn't actually happen in an office at all. And so I say I'm more connected and more involved in the lives of my coworkers, even though we are all remote over 6 continents, than we were in the office. But that meeting wouldn't have happened without marketing leadership taking the initiative to meet with our people group and saying, what do we need to do to build camaraderie amongst our team in a virtual way? And then it's on the people group to set things like this up. So you have to add additional responsibilities to be intentional about something like informal communication, which just happens spontaneously in an office. And just in general, remote makes you be more intentional about everything. You have to be intentional about documentation. You have to be intentional about adding those agenda docs to the meeting invites. It's not just going to happen on its own. You have to be intentional about structuring things like talent shows so that people don't lose the relational bonds that bring them all together. You have to be intentional about documenting your culture. A lot of companies in a co-located space, like the culture is just kind of the energy and the vibe that you get when you walk in the building, which by the way is terrible. It's just like whoever is the most charismatic like dictates the culture of the company, which is not ideal in any way, shape, or form. So you have to write it down. Like, what are our values? What is our North Star? What will we tolerate and what will we not? How do we make decisions? What's the hierarchy? Write it down. And if you haven't written it down, now is the perfect time to start. Like, this is the moment where the world has, like it or not, given you a reset button, given you a pause button. And I think on the other side of this, you're going to see companies that embrace this and said, all right, what can we do with this time? Should we start documenting more? Should we start laying out our processes more? Should we make our environment more inclusive so that people can get connected and understand what's going on in the company no matter where they are? Or you're going to have companies that just kind of stumble through this, just like crossing their fingers that they can get back to the office soon and like nothing will change. I think it'll be a big litmus test for companies that go one way or the other.
So we got a couple other questions that have come in. What, you talked about the asynchronous meeting. What is the general turnaround time for conducting those meetings and coming to the meeting goals? Like, what does that typically look like at GitLab?
Totally depends on how big or small the work is. A great example that happened last week is our CMO actually laid out, like, here's my vision for marketing over the next 12 months. So he laid out all of this out in an issue, and he shared it with the marketing team in the Slack channel. And he's like, hey, I'm accepting feedback on this for the next week. And so that gives people a week to get all of their input in. And then he's going to meet with his staff and they're going to hash something out. So end to end, we're going to have a really good view of what marketing should be for the next year in 2 weeks. That's actually amazing. Like, if you try to do that in meetings, it will take you a lot longer than 2 weeks. A lot. And so the question, I know where the question's coming from, but don't think about it in terms of like for like. You're not trying to figure out a way to make virtual meetings better. What I want you to ask is, what is the outcome that I used to get out of a meeting that I liked? Now, what's the best way to get to the outcome in a virtual way? You can probably hear my pup. This is real life. Whiteboarding is a great example of this. This often comes up on, give me just a second.
It's real life, it's okay. There's Darren in the road, not getting hit by a car.
Yeah, that's me avoiding traffic in Alabama Hills, California.
Nice.
A common question we get from design teams is, well, how do you whiteboard
a
remote setting? Like this is, I actually call it the whiteboard fixation. It's like people are just so fixated, like, how do I whiteboard remotely? It's the wrong question. What moved your business forward out of the whiteboard? What was the actual outcome of the whiteboard, which will be different for every company? Now, how do you get to that outcome now that you don't have the limitation of you have to box people into a boardroom for an hour? That's the right way to think about it. And there are a ton of digital tools that enable screen sharing and that enable whiteboarding. Mural is an amazing one. CoScreen is an amazing one. This is going to be the gold rush of apps that enable remote collaboration. I mean, it's just crazy. I'm connected with a couple of VCs that are investing heavily in the remote space, and the amount of tools that are coming out is just unbelievable. So I think in 6 months, there's going to be like-for-like software that solves a lot of this. But I would say right now is a good opportunity to kind of ask the question of, is there a better, more efficient way to do this? Focus on the outcome, not the medium. Oh, I think you're muted, Shannon.
Sorry. Does GitLab do any scheduled daily stand-ups, or do you just schedule things as needed?
We do. So my remote team, we do 3 a week. So we do noon on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And they're really useful. We get together for 25 minutes and we focus on discussion items that were added the day prior in the agenda doc. And the cool thing is anyone that can't make it for any reason, it's no big deal because it's all documented. You can actually put your discussion item in there and then the group will discuss it. And then you can see what came out of it. And then we'll meet again in 2 days and we can take it further. So we're not saying that we never have meetings. I mean, we have those 3 stand-ups a week and they're really useful. We actually have a guideline in the handbook on when we can have a meeting and when we can't. And generally, it's if we're going to go back and forth on the same thing more than 3 times, we try to get together in a synchronous fashion and hash it out. The difference is most people would say like, oh, anything in business you talk about more than 3 times. But it goes back to the thing of iteration. We're not asking about the FY21 marketing plan. We're asking about this one component about it. Like, can we come to an agreement about this one component using something that's more transparent, like a GitLab issue, so we can track this, can be documented. It's not just in this vacuum of one-on-one conversation. But it takes a lot of rewiring. I say there's as much to unlearn as there is to learn. And that's one of the things. Instead of defaulting to that, that's why I recommend you put some of those forcing functions in place so it just makes you pause for a second and do things a little bit differently. It's amazing how quickly it becomes natural. We have new people join GitLab, and for the first month, they struggle. They're just like every day they're trying to do it exactly like they've always done it for 20 years. And then after about a month, after they've heard like, oh, it's this way, oh, it's this way, it's like, then they get it and it makes it impossible for them to ever go anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing how quickly it works. You just have to be deliberate about making sure that the entire company actually gives it an earnest try.
Yeah, so the next question I have is sort of double pronged. I've heard from some friends who are working from home in different settings that, they're struggling with sort of multiple roommates and limited spaces and having to, sort of alternate who gets the floor to do a conference call, and designating small spaces, especially in the Bay Area, for work. And that leads to sort of 2 things. I think you have people who both feel like they're not getting any, real work done, but we're also struggling, I think, a lot of us to really get the deep work done. And my question around sort of deep work is, how do you think about GitLab's remote employees managing to have that dedicated time to really go into a project and lose themselves without a dozen things getting in the way or calls or whatever?
So a couple of things. What's happening right now is not indicative of what will always be. It's actually harder for us to get deep work done right now because everything is kind of manic. But when things are going well, when you are back to normal, the reason why you want to lay this asynchronous infrastructure is because if you can cut out 3 or 4 hours of meetings in your day, that's your deep work window. And that's why we're so adamant about doing it, because we all recognize that that's where work gets done. But it's never going to happen unless you take control and start figuring out a way to remove meetings or pivot the work in meetings to a different format. And so in the here and now, it might be a little bit harder. We're all in kind of like, let's just get through this mode. So I wouldn't expect any kind of crazy epiphanies right now. But it's worth laying the groundwork now, such that when things do calm down and some stabilization returns, you've built in the workflows to remove the meetings out of your day and block it for work. We're also super transparent. Like at GitLab, we encourage people to block time in their schedule, especially now with the kids at home. It's like, look, I'm going to be teaching my kids from this hour to this hour. Like, do not book a meeting right now. Or I need this period for deep focus work. Or I'm going to be exercising at this hour. I mean, literally anything. There's no stigma around it whatsoever. Like your life is first and work is a component of it. And we're just very open about that. And so if you go to book a meeting with someone and you see something like that, people respect it. Company-wide, if you do that, you end up having more time for deep work because you have less people kind of shoehorning meetings into people's days. But it has to start at the very top and cascade all the way down. Because if you have managers and leaders that are the exception, like, oh, we can just book meetings whenever we want, like you ruin the whole thing. It has to be a company-wide agreement.
Mm-hmm.
About the working space question, it's tough because a lot of people bought one bedroom apartments in San Francisco because they didn't intend on working there. That's not an ideal space to work. In the interim, I would say try to separate your living space and your working space as best you can. I've even seen some GitLabbers, like they legitimately just buy like a kind of a frame and then like hang a curtain. So they're in, like they only have one room, but at least they've created some sort of separation. It's very temporary. It's just a curtain, but it helps. You can go inside the curtain, put your noise canceling headphones on, and at least escape somewhat. The second order of this, what I think is going to happen is you've got 100,000 Googlers right now in Silicon Valley. They're going to be working from home for the next 3 or 4 months. And then at some point, management's going to say, all right, everybody come back to work. And you're going to have tens of thousands of people that are going to look at each other and they're going to say, like, we all just got our jobs done for the last 4 months. I saw my family more. I cooked more. I'm healthier. I worked out more. I slept more. I didn't spend any money on gas and I didn't commute. How about no? And I'm going to keep the job. I think that when you have tens of thousands of people that recognize that at the same time, this is going to be the start of a massive societal shift. I was talking with an analyst last week, and they said the early indications are from teams that were thrust into remote during this period, there will be at least 15 to 20% of them that never go back to the office as the default. They'll go to the office for special occasions. Like if you have a contingent of people flying in from overseas and we need to wine and dine them in the office, okay, fly me into the office, that's fine. But I'm never going to go back as the default. My default will be here. Mm-hmm. The next layer of that is, well, why am I in a 1-bedroom apartment in San Francisco if I never go into the office? This is not an optimal place to live. It's not an optimal place to work. Actually, land in Idaho looks pretty good. Better air quality, lower cost of living, better schools, more land, and I'm going to keep my job. And I think this is the great decoupling of geography and work. And you're going to start to see that. And then it's going to upend how businesses think about what real estate they invest in, where they invest in it. We're still a little bit further out from that, but I just think it's useful to know that because people get so caught up in like, oh, my 1-bedroom apartment is not ideal for work. Like, you're right. So maybe there's a better place that is more amenable to that and just more amenable to your life. But sometimes it takes permission to have that imagination because people are just so used to only using their home for not work. And it takes some imagination.
You need to do another edition of your book about this time.
Yeah.
Maybe think about that, Darren.
I appreciate that. What I say is that the worldwide embrace of remote has been accelerated by at least 10 years. Yeah. We all knew this was coming. I mean, remote isn't new. Anyone that travels and uses Wi-Fi on a plane to get work done, like you've worked remotely. I mean, let's be honest. Even if you've worked in an office where there's some people on the 3rd floor and some people on the 5th floor, you're remote to each other. I mean, look at the Googleplex. People are on opposite sides of the street and they have entire meetings on Hangouts because it's like, that stoplight's too long. Like, I'm not going over there. We've all been working remotely and not calling it remote work forever. It's just that now we have no choice but to admit that that's the case. And again, it goes back to the litmus test of companies that are honest with themselves and say, you're right, we are remote and we're only going to become more remote. It adds more discipline to your business. It adds more intentionality to your business. Some of the things are more difficult. You're like, oh, we've got to document more. We've got to write more things down. We've got to be more prescriptive and less ambiguous. We can't judge people and praise and promote people based on how often we see them in the office. We actually have to judge them on the results, not the hours spent. Yeah, all of that takes more work, but all of that makes you a better business. Well, and so the companies that embrace that are going to be better off long term.
So quick flag for people on the call. After this call is over, we're going to share out some resources to our portfolio teams based on things both that Darren has written and that we've seen as best practices, and Theo helped put that together. So thank you. A couple of things. When you talk about managing people and teams and how you judge them based on, you're not seeing it in the office, but it's the output, not the effort, right? Which I've always loved. But I think for some people, they struggle to manage remotely. Do you need to manage people remotely in terms of like squads or teams having daily check-in and check-out? how do you, do you establish core hours for product and engineering? What are your thoughts on those things?
It's a lot easier if you hire for this. So at GitLab, people opt into what we're doing. They know what they're getting into. Our entire GitLab handbook is public. If you printed it out, it's over 5,000 pages. We have nothing behind closed doors. It's all public. And we can share some of those resources. In fact, if you go to allremote.info, all of the remote guides that I've written and published on how we do everything in the remote space, it's available there. Tons of coffee reading, allremote.info. So it helps if you hire managers of one, you hire people that want to work remotely. They want to prove themselves with metrics, not with hours. It's a little more difficult if you've been thrust into this and you have people that love the office. Like that's where they want to be. And so they actually struggle to deliver in a similar way when they're in a remote setting. There's a lot of ways to unpack it, but I would say start here. Start from a place of trust, autonomy, and empowerment, not from a place of micromanagement and fear. If you suddenly become a remote management manager and your first thought is, what are the additional rules I need to put in place? You're doing it wrong. That is, it might work for some people and it might work in the short term, but trying to force a command and control atmosphere into a remote setting is a recipe for long-term disaster. You're going to burn your people out. You throw them that rule book, they're opening up LinkedIn, guaranteed. Like adults are not going to put up with it. And command and control and micromanagement actually feels more pronounced and even more vindictive in a remote setting than the exact same thing happening in the office, because there's no body language, there's no visual cues, there's no like, I'm doing this for your own good. It just feels bad. And so what I say is lead with trust, lead with autonomy, and say to the direct, what do you need from me? Like, I understand this is a new situation, so I'm your servant leader right now. What do you need from me? Like complete open channel of feedback. What can I do to make you productive and create the best possible atmosphere and environment for you to work in? And a lot of it might be, I need metrics. I need less ambiguity on what you expect from me. Because a lot of times in the office, there's a certain degree of subjectivity where it's like, they're just generally doing well. Like people just generally like the projects that they develop. That's just not going to fly remotely. And it's on the manager to crystallize, what do I expect from this person? What is the actual thing that I need from this person that we can agree to be judged on? And you remove that ambiguity, you're going to have a much better working relationship. If there's ambiguity, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes managers who are thrust into remote management worry about, when you're setting deadlines, are you micromanaging, or when you're somehow prescriptively telling people how to get their work done. And it's kind of a balance, isn't it? In terms of.
Yeah, I don't think deadlines are micromanagement. I think you set the expectation and then let people get it done however they want. Mm-hmm. And be open to feedback if they're asking you for help on getting it done however they want. That's the wrinkle. It's like, if they come to you with issues and challenges, don't assume that they're not getting it done. They're trying to honor the deadline. So we use deadlines and milestones all the time in issues. We have this campaign. We need all the assets in by Friday. Get it done however you want. And the cool thing in a remote setting is when you have those standouts, we can just be transparent with each other and say, like, I mean, honestly, I'm not tracking towards getting this done because of this blocker and this blocker and this blocker. You have to have that transparency as a team because no one can see what's going on. There is no office for you to look over and be like, wow, that corner of the office is really frazzled. Like, we should probably expect them to go a little slower. Like, you're never going to know what anyone else is dealing with. So you have to open up that avenue of transparency. But no, I don't think deadlines are micromanagement. I just wouldn't say like, let's have a check-in at the beginning and end of each day to see how it's like, I mean, maybe if it's a super junior employee and you have a conversation and they would prefer that, but I would say let people opt into that. Don't just assume that that's going to be how they prefer to be addressed.
So I think Tom had a question.
Yeah, I one thing I am curious in your thoughts here. I just read this article a couple days ago about spyware just flying off the shelves.
Yes.
Of companies like and then telling their employees like, hey, by the way, we're screenshotting your desktop every 30 seconds. We're logging all your keystrokes. We're seeing what you're printing out. And it made me think that this whole remote work dynamic is going to, it almost just magnify management capabilities. In other words, the businesses that have good management, or like the CEO of Charter was like, we're not going to let anyone go remote because I know they won't be productive. Like, I know they're all going to be lazy and they're going to sit at home and like, sunbathe. And it just got me thinking that for, startups, which typically have culture as their big selling point because you're getting paid less, it's a higher risk, you're working harder, that dynamic is just going to accelerate between sort of poor managers and great managers in this environment. Do you sort of see it that way too? Like, this is just going to put a spotlight on like your good managers and your weaker managers in a company? Or is it like more that there are good managers in offices and good managers remote, and there's just going to be a shift in skills? So you could be a great manager, but you're a bad remote manager? Or do you think it's more, I sort of looked at that discussion, I'm like, oh, this seems to me just sort of good managers versus bad managers. But I'm really curious what your perspective is on that.
I think it's mostly the former. It's mostly going to be a litmus test of what is the genuine fabric of the company. That said, I do think there will be some managers that have managed to function in an office that will struggle remotely, but give themselves permission to learn, and they will end up getting better at it. I talked with Martin, the CEO of HackerOne, on an interview. If you go to GitLab Unfiltered, our YouTube playlist is a remote work playlist. You can find it there. And he said something really insightful, which is a lot of managers have managed to where they are based on charisma in the office. But it's actually a fallacy of being a good manager. And so when you go remote, it immediately spotlights what all the fallacies were. And the only thing that matters is how actually empathetic you are, how actually helpful you are. When you hear feedback, can you connect the dots to help someone? Can you mentor someone? Can you help someone overcome an obstacle? Can you look across the organization and rally help to help someone else? This is the actual work that in a lot of co-located spaces ends up being masked by persona and other random things that have nothing to do with management. That's going to be one of the biggest things, is like that veil has been torn off and you're never going to put this genie back in the bottle. And for companies like Charter, with that example of like, we can't go remote, like no one's ever going to get any work done. I mean, they're going to attract the people that they're going to attract. It's like, it's great that they're telling you that, because now you know where not to apply. That's why if you look at the jobs FAQ on GitLab, there's a section that I wrote called What's It Like to Work at GitLab? It's about 3 paragraphs and about 4 links. And I'm confident that if you read all of that, you will know what it's like to work here. And you'll know, is it worth your time to apply? Is this a place that I'm going to thrive or not? And I think this is going to encourage a lot of companies to put that out there, because like, you want your recruiting pipeline to be cleaner anyway. It behooves you to do it. And it forces you to ask yourself that question. Like, if I had to write down what it's like to work here, would I love what I write? Mm-hmm. Probably something that should be thought about. And one more wrinkle on that Charter thing. Look, some businesses are not as amenable to remote as others. It's just the bottom line. Like there's just some work that is more amenable to it. There's some classes of work that it's going to be harder to do it remotely. It's actually more efficiently to do it somewhere else. So it's not an all or nothing thing. It's like, this is just the moment to consider, what could we learn about remote first practices to make our business more efficient? I even think there'll be some businesses where there's a hardware manufacturing component, which right now the leaders would say, like, because we have to physically bolt something to something, we can never be remote. But maybe they're going to look at it now and say, well, that part of the business can't be remote, but HR, finance, marketing, development, all of that can be remote. So we're actually going to divest a lot of this real estate, just keep this manufacturing facility, and then implement remote in the departments that we can. It's very much less of a binary all or nothing thing that's being, people are at least considering that now with the COVID-19.
Quick question. You talked about hiring practices briefly, in terms of, you've got this simple 3-paragraph thing of what's it like to work at GitLab. How do you remotely onboard new hires, and how do you make them feel included in the organization?
So GitLab uses GitLab to onboard new employees. So your onboarding is literally a GitLab issue with 200 checkboxes organized by weeks, 1 through 4. Here are the things that you need to read and do and check off on. And then when you're done, you'll know that you're onboarded. Again, no ambiguity. Like you know, are you done or not? You also know that everyone else onboarded exactly the same way. So you never have to wonder if you got like a weird onboarding or like, did I get everything? Like everybody gets everything. It also helps because it teaches people how to use GitLab, the tool, which is core to our job. But I think what companies could do right now, one of the things that I've heard is like, hey, we're a co-located company. We have people lined up to start on Monday. Now everybody's remote. Like, how do we bring this new person in? That's tough. If you don't have the infrastructure laid where they can onboard asynchronously and a lot of it's self-service and documented, it's going to be very tough. But one thing you can do is look into GitLab's onboarding buddies. If you Google GitLab onboarding buddy, you'll see the page there. We pair every new hire with someone that's been at the company for at least 3 to 6 months. This person is their direct 24/7 contact for a month. They can ask them anything. Who's responsible for this? Who's the DRI for this? I'm confused about this. I'm reading this, but it just nothing makes sense. Can you help me with this? Can you help me set up a coffee chat with somebody in the engineering team? It's one person. It makes the new hire feel very comfortable because they don't have to interrupt the entire organization. They can just go to this one person and help them get acclimated to the company. Any company can do that. Even if you're a newly, suddenly remote company, pair somebody up, give them their Zoom link, and you essentially act as an onboarding mentor for the first month. So that helps. It doesn't solve everything. I would say you have to have everything documented for onboarding to work really well. But the buddy can help. At least they can serve as a guide.
So I guess another question that just came in is, do you think that orientation and onboarding should be a sort of a multi-week process as opposed to really concentrated the way that most of us think of it in an office environment?
For sure. So GitLab onboarding is the core tasks end at 4 weeks, and then some of them like long tail into month 2. It's like kind of self-discovery from there. But the big thing is in week 1, no work happens. None. Like it's just learning. And so if you wanted someone to be doing something on week 1, you should have hired them earlier. Like this is not the fault of the new hire. You are laying the foundation, investing in this person to be an asset to your business for a long time. They will remember how they were onboarded. It will forever color how they interpret your culture. If you mean what you say, I mean, it's a big deal. And so we are diligent about shielding week 1. Like this person is here, but for all intents and purposes, they're not. Like call them in a couple of weeks. And this is something that's, it's easy to be like, oh, we're not going to do that. But it's like, it's a week or 2. It's worth it for the long tail benefits of having this person be valuable and invested in the culture. And it's big for us. I know it might not work for everybody, but we've seen great benefits from it.
I think it's remarkable really that you guys have got a roadmap for what so many of us are finding ourselves doing now. And ultimately, as you say, 20% of us may be doing it forever. So with that, we'd love to kind of open up the floor. We're unmuting everyone. If anybody wants to throw out a question for Darren, that's great. I know we just have a few more minutes before Darren probably has another speaking event. Do you have more today? Are you busy?
No, not more today. I have a couple tomorrow, but yeah, the road show continues.
Well, you've been so generous with your time. We really appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions for Darren before we sign off today? And we'll definitely follow up with all the resources that he mentioned and talked about.
Yeah, and as people mull that over, just to give you some context of how we like to think at GitLab, my goal is to answer every question anyone ever asks me with a link. And this is how tightly woven documentation is to our culture. So every question that I've got today, what I'm thinking is like, there's a link for that. There's a link for that. It's already laid out. There's a roadmap for that. So that way, like, even if you were interrupted during this call, it's okay. You can just search for it. You can find the link. You can read it on your own time, and you can implement it in a way that makes sense to your company. So even internally at GitLab, whenever we get a new question, I'm like, how does this work? Do we have this? Do we have that? We try to create a link for it so that we can pay it forward and answer with a link.
Hey, Darren, I've got a question. Thanks again for giving us your time today.
Absolutely.
Was just curious, what's been the toughest experience you've had, or the best learning experience in terms of learning to work remotely?
The toughest for sure at GitLab has been the cancellation of Contribute. So Contribute, we get the entire company together in person for a week every year. So although we're all remote, in person is a huge part of what we do. We're very intentional about when we can get the whole team together, because there's a lot that comes from being in the same place. So people mark this week on their calendar. It's like they look forward to it. It's like almost no work, just excursions, getting to bond with people, meeting everybody. Because of COVID, that got canceled. So it's not happening at all this year. We have to wait all the way until next year to get everybody together. That has really weighed on me. It's like, that's the biggest bummer, that I don't get to go and see all of these people from all of these places. And I feel like I'm going to miss that. Like the year ahead will be a little less energetic. It'll be a little bit less spark because we didn't have that. So that's been really tough. But more on the day-to-day, the toughest part of my job is when people come into the company, getting them to believe that they have permission to drop prior organizational baggage and genuinely do things differently. It is so hard, because in many cases, the way we do meetings, or the way some of our values are worded, it could get you blacklisted or terminated at prior orgs. And if that has happened to you, it's like the Pavlovian experience where it's like, I will never do that again because of that negative consequence. And it's like, you got to believe you're in a new place. Like, this is our culture. And so I would say, if this is something that you're facing, figure out ways to reinforce culture. We actually tie discretionary bonuses where anyone can nominate someone else for a discretionary bonus, but you can only nominate them for values. You can't just be like, oh, bigger sales or whatever. It has to be tied to a value. And that enables us to continually reinforce what the values are and decouple it from the monetary results.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right, well, I think that's it for today, but we will follow up later this afternoon with some documents. And Darren, we can't thank you enough for making time to join us and talk to these startups. And we look forward to following along on your career with GitLab, and looking forward to the next edition of that book about being a nomad in the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for the time, everyone. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter at Darren Murph. If you have any other suggestions on how to make our handbooks better, let me know. You can submit a merge request yourself. Everyone can contribute. Thank you very much. Godspeed. Be well, and let us know if we can help. That's what we're here for.